Following John F. Kennedy's assassination in 1963, Lyndon B. Johnson became president, serving as the 37th president of the United States from 1963 to 1969. Unlike John F. Kennedy, Johnson did not grow up wealthy, but was as earthy and elegant as his predecessor. Lyndon B. Johnson knew how to manipulate people and power to achieve his goals and recognized the importance of government in regards to improving American lives. Despite differences between Kennedy and him, Johnson kept Kennedy's ambition alive. And Johnson had achieved that through his idea of a great society. The idea of a great society was born in 1964 when Johnson gave his commencement address. He envisioned an America founded on liberty and joy, an America with no poverty and racial injustice, an America where the people could reconnect with nature, an America where people thought about their goals and dreams instead of qualities of their goods.
The first agenda of Johnson and his Great Society was civil rights. Johnson had made the civil rights his first priority by signing the Civil Rights Act of 1964 into law. The goal of this act was to end legal discrimination on the basis of color, race, origin, and religion. There were different opinions on women gaining equality, but the bill was still passed due to a group of women members in the House of Representatives who voted in favor of this new bill. In the South, legal means were still used to deprive black Southerners of their constitutional rights, and in the North, African Americans still lived in the worst urban neighborhoods and attended the worst urban schools. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 had many ways to enforce the legislation. The federal government was given the ability to withhold federal funds from public agencies and federal contractors that took part in discriminatory practices. Along with the increased federal power and regulation, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission was established, also known as EEOC, in 1964. The job of EEOC was to investigate discriminatory practices outlawed by the Civil Rights Act. However, it did not pay much attention to sex discrimination, which was clearly outlawed. Despite these efforts by the federal government, many Americans believed that it was not the government's job to end racial discrimination. The South believed that the federal government was interfering with their local customs, while the people in the North felt displeased due to the uprisings and riots in the urban ghettos.
In the election of 1964, Lyndon B. Johnson ran on the Democratic platform, and Barry Goldwater, the senator from Arizona, opposed him as a Republican nominee. Goldwater voted against the 1964 Civil Rights Act and opposed the National Social Security system, for he believed that individual liberty was the most important American value. Goldwater was a radical in the sense that he believed the nuclear weapon should be used to fight against the country's enemies. On the other hand, Johnson supported civil rights in his platform, and he signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, practically throwing all his Southern support away. During the 1964 Democratic National Convention, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, or MFDP, sent a racially mixed delegation and demanded to be seated. The white Southern representatives threatened to stage a public walkout if the MFDP delegates were seated. Even if Johnson lost the MFDP and support from the Deep South, he won the election by a landslide.
One of the final advances in the movement of equality and civil rights in 1964 pertains to the 24th Amendment to the Constitution. The amendment passed on January 24, 1964, abolished various poll taxes that citizens of the U.S. had to pay in order to vote in federal elections. As a result of this amendment, many formerly unqualified black and whites who couldn't vote because they could not afford the poll tax could now vote in the elections. In late 1964, the SCLC, or Southern Christian Leadership Conference, had declared voting rights with the utmost priority. Civil rights activists, including Martin Luther King Jr. and others, attempt to confront the people of Selma, Alabama, who were against the civil rights movement through peaceful protests and marches. But on March 6, 1965, state troops began to attack the peaceful protesters on their way to Montgomery. This confrontation, along with many others, ultimately caused the president to address his support to the people in Congress regarding the Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act outlawed discrimination that prevented blacks from voting in the Deep South. This was the first time in history that the federal government dealt with voting issues that had been originally left to the states. As a result, the number of African Americans registered to vote increased exponentially from 7% to 60% in Mississippi alone.
On a different level, the civil rights movement also focused on equal treatment regarding race or nationality. The existing immigration quota set at the time went against the goals of the civil rights movement. These acts had discriminated against people from Southern and Eastern Europe as well as Asians. In order to improve the situation, Congress passed the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, also known as the Hart-Celler Act. This act had removed the earlier quota systems and focused on reuniting immigrant families, rather than prioritizing influx of skilled labor. As a result, more immigrants began to come from countries such as Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Within the next 2 decades, the immigration from Asia rose from 6% to 35%, while European immigration rates fell from 60% to 22%.
One of Johnson's primary goals was to expand the economic opportunities of the American people. This has been achieved and started by passing the Economic Opportunity Act in 1964. The act proved to be a centerpiece on war on poverty and aimed to provide job training, adult education, and loans to small businesses. Programs of the act included VISTA, Volunteers in Service to America, the Job Corps, the Neighborhood Youth Corps, Head Start, Upward Bound, Family Planning, Community Action Programs and agencies, and many others. All of these activities were regulated and controlled by the Office of Economic Opportunity, whose main job was to eradicate poverty. One of the key features that allowed people to take part in the war on poverty was the community action programs and agencies. These programs, supported by the Act, involved poor Americans creating anti-poverty programs in their own communities. The communities allowed the poor to determine what would help them the most, and this had served the most controversial factors of the EOA. By the end of the Great Society, there would be over 1,600 community action agencies.
The next integral part of the Act was the creation of Job Corps. Like the Act itself, the Corps' main goal was to offer more economic opportunities. These Job Corps helped disadvantaged youth gain employment and complete their high school education. The Job Corps had been influenced by the Civilian Conservation Corps and the Farm Security Administration, along with various urban projects and community development of the 1930s. By the end of the century, the program cost approximately $1.2 billion a year, had enrolled close to 70,000 men, of which approximately 70% were minorities, and had assisted over 1.9 million men. Alongside various programs and corps which aimed to offer opportunities to minorities and the poor, there was VISTA, or Volunteers in Service to America, a program envisioned by the previous President John F. Kennedy. VISTA was set up as a Peace Corps at home and began to rapidly gain support. The Peace Corps grew tremendously, from starting with only 2,000 members in 1965 to more than 3,600 in 1966. VISTA ultimately helped with many projects around the country, including block watch clubs, credit unions, small businesses, and community groups, while also hiring professionals to help. Along with the creation of new programs, Johnson's administration expanded existing foundations to help the war on poverty. During the years, it expanded the food stamp program through the Food Stamp Act of 1964. The main goal was to prevent hunger and improve the social conditions of people with low incomes through the use of exchangeable food stamps for groceries.
The war on poverty was one topic that was greatly controversial from the beginning. Leftists thought that the interference from the government wasn't helping at all to change the structure of inequality. On the other hand, conservatives argued that the Great Society programs were making the American people too dependent on the government. Supporters also noted that the programs were not funded with a sufficient amount of money and were made with too many political compromises. Yet programs improved the quality of housing, healthcare, and nutrition that was made available to the poor, and money spent continued to increase, only adding to the growing federal deficit. Within a few years, up to 20% of the federal budget was used to pay the interest on the debt. The anti-poverty programs indeed did make thousands of people dependent on the government and tended to undermine family workers, since families with low-earning jobs could get more money from the government programs. The political compromises created during the era also created further trouble, since Congress often sided with business, where they would help reimburse some costs for accepting healthcare patients. In the end, with positive effects came negative impacts.
As 1964 was ending, the war on poverty had shifted its goals. From the start, the war on poverty focused on equal opportunity, mainly through offering economic opportunities and assistance with jobs, but it would soon also help with education. In 1964, 8 million American adults had not finished 5 years in school, more than 20 million had not finished 8 years, and around 54 million people hadn't even finished high school. With these rising numbers, Congress had passed the Elementary and Secondary Education Act in 1965. It provided money for school libraries and funded education programming along with other programs to help students learn outside of school. For the first time in history, the federal government was funding education below the college level. Acts and laws supporting education was accompanied by the Higher Education Act, which created a National Teachers Corps, which ultimately ended up helping poor black colleges. Overall, as a result, more people were being educated and assisted by programs such as the Head Start program and the Upward Bound program, which assisted preschoolers. By the end of the 1960s, the percentage of African Americans obtaining a high school diploma rose from 40% to 60%, and ultimately, 60 bills provided for better equipped classrooms, scholarships, and low interest student loans.
As 1965 passed, urban renewal served as a major component of LBJ's Great Society. Due to the various impacts of World War II, many were left without good and affordable housing. In 1965, Congress had created the Department on Housing and Urban Development. It expanded funding for public housing and assisted previously established housing programs. As a result, more Americans could purchase a home.
Accompanied by the revival of urban life and the providing of better housing for the people, the Great Society envisioned better environmental conditions. Originally, conservationists prioritized preservation of the land, but now focus on protecting the environment. The improvements on the environment had started in 1963 with the Clean Air Act and had continued through 1964 with acts such as the Water Resources Research Act, but were declared a national goal in 1965. This had been achieved through a multitude of acts, including the Water and Air Quality Acts in 1965. To further enforce these ideas, the Clean Water Restoration Act of 1966 was passed and imposed fines on polluters. Other legislation supporting this idea included the Land and Water Conservation Fund Act, which established a national system financing state and federal acquisition of land to develop and improve. Overall, President Johnson was able to clean up the environment and preserve its natural heritage in a time of rapid industrialization.
Despite a steady focus on environmental issues in 1965, other varying issues were addressed. With poverty rising in the 20th century, the number of elderly with no health coverage began to rise. In order to combat these numbers, two bills were passed in 1965, with the first being Medicare. Medicare offered health care to those aged 65 and above. As a result of the act, the number of uninsured seniors fell sharply to the point where they all had Medicare. The second federal program was Medicaid. Medicaid was aimed to provide health care to the poor who were not self-sufficient. Ultimately, as the years passed, such legislation increased federal debt. Arts also served as a topic to improve the lives of the people during these years. The National Endowments for the Arts and Humanities agencies were established in 1965. The National Commission on the Humanities believed that the importance placed on science endangered the study of humanities and arts. The NEA offered support and funding for projects relating to art to promote humanities and arts in the country.
By 1966, most Great Society legislation had been passed improving the war on poverty, civil rights, and easing American life, but changes still continue to occur. With aims to improve American life still prevailing, Lyndon B. Johnson and Congress initiated the Model Cities program in 1966. In the 1950s, American cities and urban centers began to thrive less. The city became crowded, environmentally unfriendly, and were characterized by hard and unhealthy living conditions. This led to the Model Cities program, which allocated federal funds to improve the urban cities. The same year, the Department of Transportation was also established. This oversaw the development of urban public transportation networks.
By the end of the 1960s, the Great Society programs began to dwindle on the face of the Vietnam War, but legislation still continued to improve the lives of Americans. In 1967, the Public Broadcasting Act had been passed. With the growth of commercial radio and television in the mid-20th century, educational and artistic programming was being undermined by advertisers and entertainment programs. Due to the combined lobbying of big corporations, funding for public television became successful. The resulting corporation for public broadcasting used federal funds to promote and support television programming too risky for many networks. The main goal of the corporation and the act was to provide educational and informative television, which mainly targeted less represented groups, including children.
One of the final legislation passed in 1968 was the Civil Rights Act of 1968, otherwise known as the Fair Housing Act. The act was created to protect individuals and families from discrimination, selling, renting, financing, or advertising of housing. This act had mostly applied to African Americans, Latinos, and Asians. This act was introduced in 1966, but following the death of Martin Luther King Jr., supported the bill and a civil rights activist, along with pressure by the NAACP, President Johnson encouraged Congress to pass the bill. Eventually, the act would include provisions against discrimination based on gender and families with disabilities, but at the time, it focused on race, religion, origin, and financial status. This was yet another advance in the civil rights movement.
Oftentimes, many of the Great Society legislations were not enforced peacefully, for there would be Supreme Court cases addressing these conflicts. One of the Supreme Court cases that occurred on Civil Rights Act of 1964 was Heart of Atlanta Motel Inc. versus the United States in 1964. The Heart of Atlanta Motel Inc. case occurred in 1964 when the hotel refused to rent rooms to African Americans, and the owner argued that the act suppressed Congress authority. The case created a precedent that Congress could use the power given to it by the Constitution's Commerce Clause to enforce businesses to follow the Civil Rights Act. Many Supreme Court cases also occurred on the Voting Rights Act of 1965. In South Carolina versus Katzenbach in 1966, South Carolina tried to fight unsuccessfully against a clause of the Voting Rights Act, which stated that the states needed to implement and submit changes in voting districts to the Attorney General of the time, who was Katzenbach. The main question was whether the act violated the states' rights in terms of controlling elections, and in the end, the Supreme Court upheld the Voting Rights Act and the South Carolina lost.
Such outcomes were possible due to the liberal Warren Court, the Supreme Court of the United States from 1953 to 1969, which expanded civil rights and freedoms, with Earl Warren as Chief Justice. By 1966, President Johnson had made tremendous progress through his Great Society programs, but by 1968, his goals began to dwindle. The upcoming war in Southeast Asia, specifically Vietnam, began to undermine domestic reform goals. Without the financial assistance, Johnson's decision to withdraw from the presidential election of 1968 and an upcoming war, the Great Society came to a close, but the everlasting impact remained. Over a span of 5 years, the fight for civil rights made a significant progress. Poverty began to affect less people, the environment displayed significant improvements, minorities became integrated into American society, and overall lived up to the idea that America was founded on liberty and joy.